Welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole
and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and we're here at the AusACPDM conference in Cairns, Australia, to interview world-leading researchers, clinicians, and people with lived experience
to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
Welcome back, everyone, to AusACPDM. We are joined by one of our keynote speakers now, Dr. Stacey Dusing. Welcome. We are so excited to have you on the show.
Thank you. Yes. I'm so excited to be here. I love Australia.
Good. Australia is a beautiful country.
Yeah,
it is. This part of the world, Cairns, beautiful, gorgeous, a little bit humid, but I'm doing all right so far.
Yeah, I can't see how frizzy my hair is, so that's okay.
Oh, very good.
Sorry, Dana.
Well, I guess the one to start talking about is, yes, it's a keynote, but it's the presidential guest lecture.
Yes.
Let's talk about that. That sounds impressive already.
It's an extra layer of impressiveness.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm just really excited to be here and to be able to share the information and share our research that we've been doing over the last few years.
That's brilliant. And look, the title of your keynote is something that really appeals to so many of us. So hold on to your horses, everyone. Moving to think and thinking to move. So there's a lot to unpack here. And maybe let's just start, first of all, in terms of your research interests and what got you to this place to really be thinking about this kind of topic?
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. I really have two kind of major focuses of my research. One is that we need to start intervention earlier, much earlier. And the other, which is really the focus of my keynote, is the idea that children need to move in order to think, but they also need to think in order to move.
Yeah.
And so kids are motivated by their engagement with the world. And if they don't have engagement with the world, we need to teach them that before we're trying to focus on movement.
Yes.
And that is so hard for us physios to say, back off, your motor is not the thing. Biomechanics, the exact way they're moving is probably not very important if they have no idea why they're moving.
Speaking my language, now I feel speechless because I don't know what to say next.
Ties in so beautifully to, several other topics we've discussed on the podcast before that, mobility is a human right. And what you're bringing to that is this extra layer of, all the benefits that mobility brings, but there's the inverse relationship as well that, thinking involves and informs our ability to move. So, it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, thank you. And, we've been working on this for a long time and have an intervention that we developed that really runs together this idea of motor and cognitive-based interventions that we have demonstrated efficacy with a control trial and are now doing a dose-matched control trial specifically for kids with CP.
Wow.
And so the goal of really being able to show that if we can help parents understand how to scaffold both your thinking and your motor skills together, is that different? Or is it more effective than just working on your motor skills? Because in so many cases, we separate the child, right?
Yes,
we say, this is your intervention for thinking. This is your intervention for moving. This is your intervention for talking. But those things go all together, particularly in young children. And so we really have to provide our interventions in a way that we're scaffolding all of those things simultaneously or feeding off of each other.
And when you think about the role of play, play sounds so simple sometimes, doesn't it? But what is encompassed within play is, intrigue and problem solving and how do I get to this place? Ooh, I didn't quite make that work. How can I find another way? And it's just building a child that's curious about the world and therefore wants to have a go. But when you don't have that, as a physical therapist, I'm sure we've met all these children where they just don't have an interest to even move. Right? So it doesn't matter what intervention you provide. If you all hands on, which is not what we do, but if it's all hands on, we move for them. It's passive.
Right.
Yeah.
Talk us through that, like how that's because it's quite a shift now, really, and that's a shift not only for maybe families thinking that way, but it's our education for the families. That's
I
think you navigate through that.
Well, I think there's two huge challenges to it. One is we have to de-implement the things that don't work. All the passive interventions that are out there that people are still using, we need to figure out how to get people to stop using them just as quickly as we need to get them to implement the things we're showing do work, which are active, active, task specific and goal directed. And so you can't really be goal directed as a young child, if you're not playing, playing is the work of children, right? Engaging the world. And when we define play, we talk about as being self-directed purely for the sake of play. There's no purpose to it. It's not an adaptive skill. It's not learning to get to your classroom at school. It's really just for the joy of play and the joy of interacting with the world. And we can teach that to kids, but we can't teach it to a 5-year-old or not as easily as we can start when they're 2-3 weeks old and start to teach them age-appropriate play. And so we introduce play in the neonatal intensive care unit as a concept in our earlier interventions. And so it's age-appropriate. I'm not trying to get the child to like do a shape sorter. You know, we're trying to get them to engage with their parents socially. But that's age-appropriate play for a brand new newborn infant or a very preterm infant.
And I guess you're talking about, I think, I've never really totally valued definitions as much as I have recently because what we would define as play, like you just described there, or what active self-initiated actually means, because I have seen that word, hijacked in a way to kind of say, well, no, this is evidence-based because we are doing active self-initiated. And I look at it and go, not really. Because what we're meaning by self-generated, active and play, can you unpack that a little bit more for us? Because I feel like there's misinterpretations about that.
Oh, I completely agree. There are lots of people that say, oh, I'm doing active interventions because I'm only helping half the time. You know, my goal, and the way I describe this with families is I would always rather have your child be successful at doing the task by making the task easier so they can do it on their own. And so, for example, if you're working on tummy time activities in order to access the world and to play in that position, I would rather have them be on their parents' chest and an elevated position where they can play, make eye contact with mom and dad, coo with them, have a social engaged conversation for 20 minutes on mom's chest versus the 3 minutes I'm going to get on the floor when they're screaming and crying, particularly when they're a young infant. And in general, if they're crying, it's not working.
That's right.
Right? You're not getting active self-directed movement that's going to help a child learn if they're screaming and crying. It's just not going to help.
Hard to be curious about the world when you're distressed.
When it seems painful and unsuccessful.
And I think, so that's the big challenge is figuring out how do you adapt the task so that we can make sure that the child is successful in doing it in that early scaffolding. Because, the example I use for parents is if I asked you to run a marathon tomorrow, you probably couldn't do it if you're not already a runner. But if I asked you to go for a mile-long walk, then you probably could. So why are we asking your baby to run a marathon on day one? I'd rather ask them to go for a walk, which is, being on their tummy with support, where they can explore the world and learn, oh, I can do this, and have that positive interaction with their parent at the same time.
I imagine there's a lot of patience involved in developing or finding the right way to engage the child and their family. Like I'm thinking about, obviously for babies, finding the right strategy to support them to fulfill their needs. But then for those older children, you're talking about 2 and 3-year-olds who maybe haven't had that opportunity to play. How do you go about developing and initiating that curiosity in them?
It's certainly a much harder thing to work with the older children, and know that I mostly work with kids under the age of 2 at this point, but working with the 2 and 3-year-old who doesn't have the interest in the exploration, I still think we can back off and ask them to do less challenging tasks. We talk with parents and openly explain the cognitive action trade-off, right? If I'm asking you to think really hard, I can't ask you to do hard motor skills at the same time. So back off your motor skills and let them think. And again, that's hard for physios who say, my goal or my task is to teach them to walk. So I'm going to push walking and I'm going to push them to do that. But if they aren't able to think about why they're walking or what the world gives them at the same time, you're not going to get them to walk because there's no reason. There's no context for them. And everything has to be situated within that context of the family and then within play and then moving to think and thinking to move.
Love that.
And I think that can sometimes be challenging for families as well. I think particularly for families of young children or babies who have maybe been given a prognosis, or this is what life might look like for your child. They feel that urgency to do things and do them early and do them quickly.
Yeah.
But
it's the milestone. Tick off.
Yeah.
It is almost always one of the comments that we get, both from new therapists who are training in our intervention approaches, but also from parents, is the like sitting back and not putting my hands on the kid as the immediate strategy to try things, and to sit back and wait and see, can my child problem solve this skill, or can they do that? Do I have to readjust their foot just because it looks a little wonky right away? Or can I give them a chance to see if they can adjust it themselves? Or if they're still successful with the action of exploring the world, even if their foot looks a little funny when they're doing it. To try and do that. And both therapists who are learning this kind of approach and parents say that's the hardest part, to sit back and not jump in.
So my question from that one, because I completely agree, absolutely agree. There's been such a focus on form over function, right? And like you said, it's often therapists, and parents, they want to see good alignment. And my next question is a bit of an interesting one, only from my experience, because we are trying to do more hands-off. We know that's how babies learn, children learn. Actually, that's how we all learn. Let's be real, right? That's how we do it. But what you see online on social media is a direct contrast to what we know the evidence is saying. So, methods like dynamic movement intervention, huge on social media, and we see it in this age group, and it's all hands-on. It's like, look at this child step, look at this child do, and it's just the tick box of motor skill acquisition. And I've been trying to unpack and go, what's so appealing about it? And I think it's because it looks like the child is achieving these motor milestones and with the hands-on.
So you can't really say it's acquisition, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right, it's not acquisition, it's not learning. The kid's not doing any of it.
Talk us through a bit of that, because that's what we see, and that's what I think a lot of therapists are faced with, because they see this online and it's everywhere.
It is. It's everywhere. And it was interesting. I run a continuing education group as part of my job. And part of what I talk about with the therapists at the last sessions that we had were, how do we do that? How do we move beyond those passive interventions? And one of the therapists came up to me at the break and said, I can go to a continuing ed course on DMI. I can find 15 of them in the local area, to try and go to. And they're hands-on, and that's what I feel like I need to learn. All these theoretical approaches are nebulous. We're not taught actually what to do with the child to try and do that. And it's hard to evaluate that and say, when you look at some of the interventions that are out there that have evidence for them, we made a module for Start Play for continuing ed, but it is online with then video-based feedback to the therapist. Like they provide videos and we give them feedback on that. But because we think that's what therapists want is the online, because it's accessible and because we're trying to target a larger population, but you can get checked off for DMI really easily in your local area.
Such a good point.
And that's the challenge. So I think, are we doing a disservice actually by not having more continuing ed? But when you look at the evidence, our goal is to say these are key principles. I don't want to sell my intervention. I'm trying to say use these key principles. They work in any of these interventions.
It's not owned by anyone.
No. Exactly. But do we actually do a better job of when we package it and can say, for this group of kids, this is the approach that you can use to implement these key principles? Would we get more people on board?
Is that more reassuring?
With getting them checked off.
So
it's also a hard balance.
It's creativity, though. What you're talking about, that when you're helping a child to explore, and it's individualized, clinical reasoning, each child individual, being creative of what that child is motivated by, versus a checkbox that you can do this to everyone. A formula that you can do to everyone. That's easy.
It is. No, you're absolutely right that there's a huge level of that's clinical reasoning. But we can teach that to new grads.
Absolutely.
We absolutely can. We've had a couple of new grads who have gone through our training to do it as interventionists. And the fidelity level you have to maintain in our clinical trials is very high. And they can do it. They're actually better at it sometimes because they aren't trying to de-implement what they've learned. But I'll tell you that I'm a professor. I teach teach this content in an entry-level curriculum and it gets untaught to our students who have been taught this in an entry-level curriculum when they go out to the clinic and they're working in a clinic that does DMI or all these other approaches that are very passive. They very quickly stop doing the evidence-based things that they've learned if the clinic is doing non-evidence-based things where they're embedded. And so I think we really have to make sure we're not just teaching the next generation, but we need to make sure we're hitting the people who are out there practicing now and get this stuff de-implemented that is not effective. And, you know, you do that through payment models where you don't pay people for doing things that are not evidence-based.
You've heard about, well, we've been hearing about insurance models doing that. Is it in Sweden? I think their insurance model won't fund non-evidence-based. And, you know, it's
kind of where it's
pretty fair from a policy perspective. Right.
No, but it is scary to think about how do you balance that out. I mean, I don't want a family to have more work to navigate the system and to get services. But I also think the idea that families pay for some of those private therapies that are not evidence-based, that's also just painful to think, oh, you just spent
the time and
all this time
resources
and energy and the opportunity lost to learn from energy or to just play at home
and
in a way that will support
cognitive
them.
skills because that is lifelong.
It is.
Right?
Mobility and enjoy your family.
That's right. And mobility at the end of the day is so important. There's different ways of moving and that will change throughout their lifespan. But what we can make sure a person has is the ability to have some control in their life. And that's cognition, right? That's so valuable. And we just talked about with Elagas earlier, it's a human right.
It is.
As clinicians, you know, this path we're talking about is not necessarily the easiest path, but you know, it takes time, it takes development on your part as a therapist, but the payoff is enormous.
Absolutely.
I would argue worth it.
Absolutely. It is absolutely worth it to learn and to be able to provide the best care and the best interventions that we can that are the most effective for all of the domains of development for these young children.
That's beautiful. So Stacey, in one sentence or so, you know,
no pressure.
What will be your main message for clinicians out there listening to this and you know, are faced with some of these challenges? What would your advice be?
I think the biggest thing is to say, what are the key principles we know do work in interventions, and to evaluate anything you're thinking about going to train in, continuing ed in any course, and say, is this intervention aligned with the key principles we know work? Task-specific, infant-directed movement, exploring the world, and blending motor and cognition together. And if that intervention doesn't include that, it is not worth your money from a continuing ed standpoint. And it's okay to have that conversation with a parent that you don't offer that service because there's not evidence that it works, that you offer these other services that are evidence-based and that we have demonstrated examples of how they work. And I think that that's going to be the best strategy for any therapist out there to improve their skills in a way that will help actually support children and their development over time.
Beautiful.
That's brilliant.
Oh, Professor Stacey Dusing, we are so privileged to have you join us today. All the best for your presidential keynote address. I can't wait to come along now, just after this little taster conversation we've had.
It's got me buzzing. I'm trying to sit really still, hands still in my hands. But thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share information with all of your members or your attendees.
Wonderful. Thank you for listening, and hope you guys really enjoyed it. But stay tuned. There's so much more to come. Bye.
Bye.